shameless plug.
Get a small, Zana, can you get like a small table or something? Just,
Sorry?
like a small table or something?
Let me request for one. Over here?
Yeah, like just, I mean, we have a laptop that we just want to like look at.
Okay, so I have one now.
Please don't clap for anything, guys. Ankit also me. Very smart. Again, to be lawyer from national.
That's how we met. He was taking over course at Alex.
Top the class and said, let's work together. But I guess I think he's leaving. He's not going to the
When we started class.
He's going leaving the brain drain.
Oh, it's not free. It's I can't surprise nobody seeing you guys on LinkedIn. So,
Well, it's not.
No, the only thing you have to be surprised at is if you say you look different.
Thank you very much for those who are joining us online and those who are offline for coming to today's session. Today's discussion is about the Telecom Bill and specifically around the aspects of spam, encryption, KYC and user privacy and how the Telecom Bill will handle this. This discussion is put together by Goscon and it has been made possible because of the membership corpus that we have and the members of Goscon who contributed to making this happen. So we appreciate more and more of your support to make these things happen. The main goal of this discussion today is to ensure that now that the bill is likely to be tabled in Parliament or that it will be brought up for discussion soon, it is important for us as consumers, as startups and as technologists to be able to voice our concerns around the issues that we think could be done differently and how the government would take this feedback while it is considering the implementation of this bill. So with this, I'm going to hand over to Amlan Mohanty to handle today's presentation and today's proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab. We're really looking forward to this conversation. As Zainab said, this discussion around the draft Telecom Bill has become very timely and relevant given that the Parliament session has begun and we are expecting potentially some movement in various regulations, and the draft Telecom Bill is something that is in advanced stages of discussions within the government, and we thought it would be a good time for all of us to get together, discuss some of the issues. And the way that we plan this discussion today is in three parts. The first is I'll just take about 10 minutes to set the context for this discussion that we're going to have. this evening. I'll talk to you a little bit about what the key regulatory issues are, what the impact is going to be on businesses and consumers specifically. We're going to have a short presentation by Moshni and Kunal from Aarti Institute to talk about the summary of their findings from a report they have done specifically on the draft telecom bill. And then we'll move into a panel discussion for the next 30 minutes or so with some experts who we brought together, invited together to discuss this. So to start off, just to set the context, the draft telecom bill was published by the government late last year, in September of 2022. And the bill is an attempt by the government to completely overhaul existing regulation for the telecom sector. And it's actually really interesting to see that the three pieces of regulations that they're trying to update, the Telegraph Act, the Wireless Telegraphy Act, and other wireless legislation, the most recent of these are more than 70 years. So the time really has come for the government to actually update this piece of regulation. But I think what we really want to do in this conversation is to dissect the regulatory approach that the government has taken. Right? There are some interesting regulatory choices they've made, some definitions that have raised a lot of concerns, and we really want to look at what the impact would be on both startups, businesses, emerging businesses, and users. From a process point of view, as I was saying, these conversations are in advanced stages. From what we've gathered, the particular draft bill has not received cabinet approval. There is some reconsideration within the government, including on some of the issues we're going to be discussing today. So I think, again, really good time for us to be talking about this. And at the same time, last week or a couple of weeks ago, the telecom regulator, TRAI, issued a consultation paper on some of these issues, including how OTT, that's over-the-top communication services, should be regulated. So again, there are parallel policy conversations happening, so I think a good time to take stock of where the debate is at. For this particular discussion, I'd like to set the context from three perspectives, from three angles. One is what the regulatory structure of this bill and the regulatory implications are going to be. Two, specifically what the implication is going to be on innovation, especially as it pertains to startups and emerging businesses. And third is what the impact on users is going to be. So to do that, I thought let me start with what the regulatory considerations for this particular bill are. The one thing I think that's got everyone by surprise is the wide definition that the telecom bill uses for telecom services itself. And we have a lawyer on the panel with whom we're going to get into the details of this, but the fact is that when there is a wide definition for telecom services, it provides the government with a lot of power to be able to regulate them further through implementing regulations. So to just pick up on that definition, right, there are at least 4 elements in that definition I think that have caused people to be a little bit surprised. The word telecom services, as proposed in the draft telecom bill, includes email, includes voice, video, and data communication services, includes internet-based communication services, and includes over-the-top communication services. So again, just to recap, the definition for telecom services under the draft telecom bill is wide enough to include email, online messaging services, instant messaging service that use that involve data, and any data service communication services that involve voice, video, or data. Right? So very broad definition, and I think the implications of this are going to be really significant. As we'll get into more detail in the panel, if the government desires, it can license any of these services based on this wide definition. And the implications of licensing include financial obligations, so extremely expensive license fees, the fact that you would have to share data with law enforcement officials and the government mandatorily. You might have to make changes to your infrastructure network to be able to provide access to the government to data flowing through your networks, as well as the possibility that the government can use its licensing power to suspend your services. Right? There's always a threat that your services can be suspended and banned or disrupted in some way. I want to just take a step back to some of the previous conversations we've had that Hasgeek has organized on this subject, and what we've heard from experts, right, on this issue of the broad scope, the licensing and regulatory scope of the bill. The first thing that we've heard is that the government hasn't been able to clearly articulate what the objective and purpose of expanding the licensing regime is. Right? There could be many reasons for an expanded licensing regime. It could be financial reasons, extracting more revenue. It could be public security and safety issues. But what we haven't found is a very clear articulation for why the government wants to expand the definition of services and therefore expand the licensing framework. The second is that typically, from a technical point of view, license and regulatory point of view, licensing should only apply to scarce resources, right? So that's why you would imagine that telecom operator would need to obtain a license to be able to use spectrum, right, to be able to provide services. With some of the communication services or email or instant messaging services that are now within the scope of the Telecom Bill, it's not entirely clear what those scarce resources are, right? The other example that's been provided is that the numbering system is a scarce resource. But again, it's not really clear how any of these online internet-based communication services are using scarce resources. And finally, another, I think, key point that emerged from some of our previous conversations is that the licensing obligations should apply to the primary entity and cannot flow downstream indefinitely. Essentially, what that means is that if the telecom operator is obtaining a license, that should be the only entity that is required to obtain a license. It cannot be the users, the end users of the telecom operator, whether they are enterprise or retail customers. So, then just to set the context, I think those are some of the questions that we want to get into with the panel. Those are some questions perhaps that we'll hear the panelists, the presenters from our team of it. The second issue we want to spend a little bit of time talking about today is this question of identity verification or KYC, which is again a very key element of the Telecom Bill. Essentially, what the draft Telecom Bill proposes is that the identity of the person who is initiating any communication, whether it's data, text, or a voice call, must be identified and made available to the recipient of that message. So I think, again, this is drafted in very plain, simple language, but from a technical point of view, I think this raises a lot of concerns, right? Again, we've heard from experts about the question about what this means to say the sender of the message needs to be identified. Is a phone number sufficient? Right? Does this require that the name, real name of this particular person, the sender of the message, be identified? What does this mean for internet-based communication services? What does this mean for platforms where communication is only an ancillary, a secondary part of their main service? And more broadly, from a social point of view, what does this mean for anonymity and pseudo-anonymity online? There are several platforms online that do not require you to reveal your real name. So, what does this new obligation on the telecom mean for some of these larger questions? That said, I think we also heard from experts that they all acknowledge that fraud and spam involving some of these new and emerging communication services is an important issue. And I think the conversation we want to have in today's panel is what are the other technical means perhaps that we can use to solve some of these issues of spam and fraud, right? And broader questions of identity verification without having to use a broad brush when it comes to licensing. The third and last issue that I wanted to set some context on is the question of encryption and larger issues of surveillance by the government that I think are again being discussed in the context of the draft Telecom Bill. The first and I think immediate worry is what the impact of this Telecom Bill will be on encrypted communications. Again, the point I made earlier about how there is a requirement to identify the sender of a message. It's, I think, an open question about how this might impact encrypted communications. And then there's a broader discussion about how around the world there is increasing pressure from policy makers and governments to be able to weaken encrypted communications for security purposes. The UK Online Arms Bill, for example, has a requirement for companies to proactively monitor encrypted communications. And while the draft bill is not that explicit in India, it does say that certain messages or types of messages, and this seems to be an insinuation towards encrypted communications, that any of these messages or types of messages can be intercepted or must be disclosed to law enforcement officials. So it does seem to be very similar to some of the pathways that other policymakers around the world are taking. And I think what we've heard again from experts is that this was really an opportunity for the government to actually address some of these issues around broad surveillance powers and incorporate some of the safeguards that we've seen through judgments and through the constitutional right to privacy that was declared by Supreme Court recently. But unfortunately, we haven't seen that in this draft Telecom Bill. So just to wrap up, in terms of what the impact on innovation is, I think people are concerned that at a time where we're seeing increasingly startups, emerging businesses leverage the power of telecom networks to be able to provide cutting-edge services involving 5G, involving next-generation networks, involving AI and data analytics. That there is a draft telecom bill that's looking to regulate this sector more strictly rather than really think about policy incentives and enablers that would help increase their ability to innovate and make India a global telecommunications hub. From the perspective of users, again, as I mentioned earlier, this was really an opportunity that civil society was looking at for reform on the surveillance powers of the government. Instead, what we have found ourselves with is a proposal that would limit the access to encrypted communication and other types of privacy-preserving technologies for users, an increase in cost potentially for users of these services given some of the licensing requirements, and a lack of policy enablers again for users to be able to access some of these services around the world. With that, I want to hand over to Kunal and mostly from Aarti to talk a little bit about their specific findings they have found based on their report on this draft telecom bill, and then we'll move to that. Kunal?
Thanks, Anand. That was very good context setting, I think, and quite helpful for us to actually build on. And a lot of the points that you covered in itself, we've been able to kind of figure out through a more sort of more deeper approach in that sense. So, I mean, just to tell you a little bit about some of the nuances of the study that we conducted, we've basically classified the three stakeholders, like Aman mentioned, as users, government, and businesses in this case. And of course, like businesses could mean sort of a variety of different sizes, very different players. And given that the definition is one of the sort of problematic or ambiguous areas, we have kept it in a way that is also similar and wanted to kind of understand what the implication of this new draft telecommunications bill could be on these three stakeholders. So, fortunately, we have some of the people that we had spoken to during the study in this room as well, and we were able to obviously have a lot of other events and other interactions with a lot of other industry experts. We were also able to understand a little bit about what the bill might have intended to do, and while we're not necessarily saying that this is what has come out, we are trying to sort of understand what this implies in a sort of potential way, as opposed to it becoming sort of uncertainty. The hope is that there is some iteration that kind of is more sort of meaningful and effective in understanding regulation in that sense. So what we were able to do is really classify the journey of what a stakeholder, of what a business might go through if this telecommunications bill was actually enacted. And of course, a lot of this is sort of potential implications, but we've been able to classify it as financial costs, or potential financial costs, and potential non-economic implications that might arise. We were also then able to classify the journey that businesses would take as entry costs, operational costs, and legal costs. And within sort of those buckets, we were able to identify the variety of different areas where these costs might emerge. So, for example, entry costs is the operating licensing fees. There's the spectrum and network usage costs. There's also the anticipated costs, which again, due to the opaqueness of the bill, we were not quite sure what these meant, and I think continue to struggle with that ambiguity in that sense. Moving on to sort of the operational part of things, there's the user verification sort of mandate, there's the interception mandate, there's the encryption or decryption rather mandate. There's also understanding how to interlink services to, let's say, like a central monitoring system. And again, anticipated costs there too. And I think finally, we were trying to sort of understand what kind of legal costs might be implied. So there's litigation costs in case of breach, also parallel legal obligations that businesses and startups might need to actually incur. And I think finally trying to understand sort of what disputes even might look like, more in case of jurisprudence, as well as sort of identifying who the right entity might be to regulate and enforce. So yeah, I'll hand it over to Moshni now, who will just give us a little bit of some of the key areas that we found. Our report obviously covers a significant amount of detail in terms of almost all of the areas that we were able to identify. But as Aman mentioned, we have been conversing with a lot of the ecosystem in a variety of different formats. So in a way, we've been able to identify what may be immediate concerns. Not saying that the others are not, as equally in terms of its magnitude, but definitely something that we should keep an eye out for. So I'll hand it over to Moshni. She will share a little bit about the economic and non-economic implications that we might see if this draft bill is enacted, and it's going to be across the three different stakeholders. Over to you, Moshni.
Thanks, Kunal. So Kunal has already taken us through the journey of the entities in terms of the entry operational legal costs. The way I would be trying to make all of you understand in terms of cost would be the monetary cost and the non-economic implications that the bill might have on all of these three stakeholders, that is business, users and the government. So as far as the business is concerned, there is overwhelming concern around the licensing fees and the TDF contribution. Then there are things like network usage costs. Apart from that, there are compliances and legal costs and the penalties for breach in the bill. And if we take all of these things into consideration, things like licensing fees, user verification, there is a need for technological upgradation that these platforms might have to undertake if they have to comply with all of these regulations. So, since the definition of the telecommunication service is so wide under the bill and it has chosen to define and even include a lot of data communication services, internet-based communication services, and explicitly also include OTT communication services, and because it's now the privilege, it is the privilege of the government in the telecommunication sector to sort of enable people to provide services in terms of licensing. So there is a concern around these licensing fees and licensing costs having to be borne by these businesses. There's also a lot of discussion going on around the network usage costs. We have already seen that in the previous consultation paper, then the paper that came out in even 2022 around the convergence, and even the recent trial consultation paper that just released in July. There's a lot of ongoing conversation around the network usage costs and how the OTTs have to be ultimately sort of categorized, defined, and also in terms of what is the framework that should be used, either in terms of the social media, in terms of the content, or in terms of the service that they provide. Apart from these costs, there are also a lot of compliances costs that increases for the business because of the whole regime of the licensing, because there are a lot of terms and conditions under the licensing agreement, and the breach of which would mean that the government can impose penalties on these business entities. So there are a lot of costs in terms of the people who are running these businesses and also for the specific entity itself. Now, coming to the users, there are concerns around affordability, there are concerns around the cost of user verification that might have to be borne by the users, and also the potential fines on the user for misrepresentation or for using any services that might not be licensed. So the users are already paying for their services in terms of the data usage cost that is part of the subscription pack that they sort of buy for availing many of these services. So ultimately the cost that has to be borne by the businesses in one way or other is sometimes many a times passed to the user. So the question of affordability for the users remains a key concern. And then the cost for user verification, oftentimes it is assumed that user verification is a one-time cost, but there is a lot of follow-up for the users, and also there are sometimes nominal charges which has to be borne by the users. So the cost of user verification could also mean that there is follow-up users from these OTT communication services, which could again mean potential loss for many of these service providers. Now the provision around fine and misrepresentation. So the bill says that the users have to be aware about using services that might not be licensed. So if they are using any services, any of these OTT communication services that are not licensed, then there is a provision to fine for them. And also having to undertake user verification. So let's say tomorrow if I'm using any services and I fail to sort of verify myself as a user, that could also may put a legal burden on the users. Now, coming to the government, there's also concerns around the monetary costs around capacity building of many of these regulatory bodies, for example, MeitY and Department of Telecommunication, even the TDSAT, which sort of governs the litigations around the telecommunication services. Then there is monitoring and auditing costs of the service providers, and lastly, there are costs of central monitoring services and implementing them for the purpose of encryption. So in terms of capacity building, it is required by the regulatory body to sort of upgrade themselves in terms of the human resource, in terms of expertise, to be even able to understand the governing mechanism and even to regulate them. Because the moment the regulation kicks in, the government has to realize that a lot of service providers that it is bringing under the net of the regulation, so it has to also think about the monitoring and the auditing costs that it might have to incur in future. So these are some of the monetary costs that I wanted to share. Now coming to some of the non-economic implications that the provision of the bill might have on stakeholders. So as far as the business is concerned, then there is a concern around platform using users because of the dispensing of the key privacy of the business features. Then there is also concern around frictions with a lot of regulatory bodies because of the confusion and the interlinked regulatory mechanism. Then there are also concerns around reduced time and efficiency even for these services to be able to provide a quality services to the users, because a lot of these costs that would be borne, a lot of their time and effort would now go into becoming more compliant rather than improving the quality of services. So these were some of the non-economic implications for the businesses. Now coming to users, there are concerns around privacy and anonymity, particularly because of the provisions around the mandatory user verification and also the provision around decryption of the communication that happens on this platform. And apart from that, there are user hesitancy that could come up because of these provisions, and because now the platform might have to undertake mandatory user verification. So a lot of hesitancy around users around their privacy and anonymity while using this platform. And then there is also awareness and access burden, which is now being placed on the user, that they have to know before using any services whether it is licensed or not. They have to undertake user verification. And the inability or not having this understanding would land them up in form of a legal violation as per the bill. So there is a high cost of information that is being placed on the user as part of this bill. And lastly, the provisions around user verification and decryption also raises concern around data leakages and data rights for the users, because we know that the data protection bill is something that has been, the communication around that and the framework around that is something which is still shaping up in India. So there are still concerns as far as the users are concerned when we think about provisions such as mandatory user verification and things such as decryption of these communication platforms. Lastly, on the non-economic implications of the government, there are a lot of regulatory overlaps and confusions that we might have seen even with a lot of consultation paper coming up. There is a lot of conversation going around whether to converge or not, and what are the different responsibilities and how these departments sort of interplay with each other. So there is a lot of regulatory overlap and confusion, which would be caused to the government if it chooses to sort of regulate the internet services as the telecommunication services. And then there are also concerns around geopolitical sensitivities, because we know that internet now is not a borderless communication platform. It is a platform where a lot of users from different countries and different citizens are interacting with each other. So there is also concern around enforcement of many of these regulations. So the government has to also think about a lot of geopolitical sensitivities involved when thinking about and framing and coming up with regulations. And lastly, there are concerns around national security that the government has sort of pointed out in the bill. But the understanding around national security has to also be based not from the perspective of the state, but also from the rights of the user. So if you think about when it is undertaking things like decryption or user verification, is it putting a lot of data of the user in the hand of the OTT communication services, or let's say even the private providers? Especially in the lack of any protection framework for the users, whether in the form of security policies, whether in the form of any strong data protection regime in place. So these are some of the non-economic implications. Now I hand it back to Kunal to discuss some of the key suggestions from our group.
Thank you, Mashmi, for taking us through that. And I think one of the key insights for us is that, or rather the caveat for this is that it doesn't necessarily feel like it's something that's already happened. This is draft bill, so it's a potential. So I think maybe just calling that and making sure that this is something that we see as emerging possibly. Also understanding that it's not necessarily that we're saying that some specific rule or provision could result in one of these more specifically, and that it's not an isolated thing, right? It's sort of a combination of these things. And while, of course, there are some of the key concerns that we have spoken about in our report, it's also to be addressed in a more holistic manner. I think during the sort of release of this bill, the intent was to make it to ensure sort of innovation, to ensure user protection. I think we're hoping for a little bit more in that sense. A lot of user harm continues to stay unaddressed. And I think as part of this entire sort of revelation or this exploration in that sense, as part of the study, as part of the subsequent interactions with the experts in the ecosystem, biggest point I think is the definition. Right? The fact that there's not really a clear understanding of what telecommunication services even means. And that kind of creates this ambiguity, creates a bit of sort of circularity in that sense, to be able to kind of not understand what it is you're going to actually be enforced with or what you might be sort of subjected to in that sense. It also has a huge impact on sort of user affordability, choice, access, and we're seeing that across not just the telecommunications bill, we're seeing that across like a lot of different types of regulations that we've seen in India itself and outside too. In fact, the TRAI consultation paper has brought in more examples of international contexts where it talks about potential ways that these aren't addressed. I think we also have to have a very keen focus on protecting users' data, whether it's from the collection phase, and that includes sort of consent and sort of the KYC process, all the way to the management, deletion, processing of this data also should be kept in mind. And I think finally we should try to understand sort of how to continue this innovation. I don't think it's a surprise that India is one of the largest growing economies, and a large part of it, of course, attribution works differently, but a large part of it can be attributed to the growth that we've seen through the telecommunications industry. So, if innovation is the key, I think to not stifle it is something that we would hope to kind of see. And we're also sort of thinking about replacing regulation that has existed for, as Aman said, almost 70 years. We still aren't as future ready as we can be. I think a lot of these will then become iterations again, where we will see different adaptations, and we're not sure that that's necessarily the way to go. Clearly, we have a lot of experts in this room today who will be diverging their thoughts about what they kind of see in terms of the implications and how to actually even proceed further. And I think the final sort of hope or request in that sense that we had is that the collaboration between the private and public sector needs to be a bit more sort of cohesive. Consultation papers are often released with a consultative process, but often lack some stakeholders, and I think what we're requesting is maybe being part of that in a sense, and ensuring that there's a variety of different perspectives that are actually represented in a more meaningful manner. I think within the sort of Hasgeek platform, we were able to sort of exchange ideas with a lot of other experts, and again, I think definition was one of the biggest things that came out from the ecosystem. The specific costs around network usage came up as another sort of emerging thought. And I think the final being the ecosystem challenges. Now, the internet is supposed to be something that decentralizes, in a sense, power and connection. So what happens tomorrow when I'm talking to someone in a different country? Who's the person who will be kind of, or who's the entity rather, who will be taking care of that? What happens if there's a breach of some sort? Who's held responsible? Who's accountable for it in that sense? And I think in its entirety, we're trying to sort of understand what this means. And I think we, as part of this room and part of most rooms, we're very new to the telecommunications industry, but we are trying to sort of unpack all of this using qualitative methods. We're also trying to understand how we can make more meaningful contributions. The most recent trial consultation paper that's come out on sort of understanding the different types of OTT models has posed a lot of very good questions. As one of the unintended or intended consequences, we're not even quite sure what the trial's power is in a certain sense. So we're trying to sort of make sure that the voices are heard in that sense, and we're trying to also make sure that it's representative of a variety of different types of stakeholders. So that's a little bit of our report. You can access it on our website. I think special thanks to the Hasgeek team, Raf, as well as Amlan for hosting us here today. And yeah, I think looking forward to the conversation that ensues, and hopefully we're able to kind of help unpack this a little further. Thanks.
I'm sure we'll get into more of that obviously on Saturday. But firstly, welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. We have, through Hasgeek, done one other event which was online, so we thought it made sense to also do something offline, have a more informal discussion. One of the advantages of a physical event is, people can cut each other off, basically. I would love to see some of that happen. But the other, I think, idea was really Kunal, you were talking about earlier, there are lots of these questions that have arisen, but we're not really sure whether the right stakeholders have been heard. So I think we talked a little bit in my context, I think, piece, but also through your presentation about potential hypothetical implications. Some of these were principle-based arguments, some of these were potential use cases. What we really want to get into specific examples, right? And that's why we thought we'd have people here who have an understanding of how the technology works, these business models, how these technologies are being used, what the potential use cases are. So I'd love to get into some of the specifics and we would again request all of you to share personal examples with us, share examples as well. So if I can just request to just start off, everybody, you could just introduce yourself. I think that would make for a good way to kick off this time. So if we should, I can start with you.
Yes. Hey everyone, this is Rishi. I work for blockchain analytics firm at Data Science. I've had, prior to that, I've had experience in fintech, both on the product side as well as consulting. So primary areas of expertise are cybersec, blockchain, and anything that goes by fintech and big tech. Right? So that's pretty much it.
I'm Nikhil Narendran. I'm a partner at Telecom Bill, law firm, and I handle the tech media telecom practice there. I have had quite a lot of experience working with telcos and players, fintech companies on aspects related to products, regulatory issues, history. So there has to be.
Hi everyone, I'm Vivek Jatana. I work for Exotel. We are a CPaaS and a CCaaS company. And we are a SaaS product company in that sense. And probably for the longest time, I worked with the telcos. So, SaaS is on the other side of the story for me. So, I have kind of experienced both.
Sure.
So, let's see where this discussion goes.
Nice.
Hi everyone, I'm Kunal again. I'm a senior manager at Aarti Institute. We've been working on telecommunications front for almost about 6 months to a year now. We primarily focus sort of our understanding and research on the intersection of technology and society. Society plays one of the key roles. And we were trying to basically understand how we can negotiate with technology in a much more meaningful way. So a lot of our work involves a lot of policy that comes out, but we also work with platforms, we work with a variety of different types of technology. We work with a variety of different types of organizations across the world as well. And yeah, essentially we're trying to figure out what's happening and how we can sort of help.
That's okay. I realized I didn't introduce myself. I'm Amla. I'm a lawyer and policy advisor to companies, startups, think tanks, and work with a variety of organizations on the intersection of tech and society. With that, I'd love to get this panel going. Just some ground rules. One, as I mentioned, we want to keep this really informal. I don't have specific questions for any one of you. Idea is really to get multiple perspectives on the same question. We have a lawyer, we have a scientist, we have technologists who's worked with telcos, and now as a SaaS company, we have researchers in this room, and obviously I'll share my perspective where it's useful. So really, I'll throw up some questions, and I'd love for all of you to come in. If you have an alternate point of view, just raise your hand, and I'll follow you to answer. I want to start off with the point we raised earlier. We discussed earlier about identity verification and KYC, and what this means for the entire ecosystem. Right? So this is not a new concept. Of course, we know KYC is something that telcos do primarily. But really, I can see from some of the conversations that we've had with officials from the telecom department in India, they're really looking at KYC as a solution to some of these emerging problems, especially around spam and fraud. Right? Those are two examples we are offering. So I just wanted to look at what that user journey looks like on an instant messaging platform. Right? So let's say we take WhatsApp, something that obviously all of us in this room are familiar with. You sign up, you are essentially tied to your assigned mobile number that your telecom operator has provided you, and then you're good to go. Right? You aren't providing your email address. There isn't really any other unique identifier. So, Nikhil, if I can start with you, knowing that you've obviously worked with telecom operators that go through this KYC process. Firstly, if I can ask you, how robust do you think the system already is for telecom operators? We've obviously heard about people being able to submit fake documents. Anytime you watch a true crime documentary, it's always about someone who has 15 SIM cards, and I always wonder if the KYC process is so robust, how that happens. But if you can talk about how it currently operates with telcos, and you know where I'm going with this, which is if that system is so robust, why do we need another? Do we need to replicate that system, right? So if you can just talk to how it currently works with telcos, and knowing that okay, your WhatsApp identity is tied to your telecom number, and that's the existing KYC process. I'd love to ask you a little bit about what we think we should be doing.
So look, that process is not really a robust system. That's very clear, right? So there are people with multiple SIM cards. It's very likely that, let's say that I need a connection for my whole of my family. I will be submitting my documents to get connections for them. That may get traded further. It's likely that the actual KYC verification was done on one user, or it's the user is someone else. And there are also enough flexibilities. Like for instance, the problem here is that any telco is really incentivized to give more connections, right? And then you're putting the job of KYC verification on them. It's likely that that the incentives are not fully aligned, and they will take shortcuts to ensure that they give more connections. And it's often not even done at telco level. It's often done at the franchise levels, the folks who actually sell the SIM cards on the ground, right? And also, there are also multiple complications involved in this. For instance, your Aadhaar will reflect, let's say there's a migrant laborer who's coming to Bangalore to work. His Aadhaar might be from West Bengal, right? Then you actually need a connection at his home. I mean, it could be a mobile connection, it could be a wired connection. Then there are possible alternatives that the government itself provides. You need one address, then he could give a rent agreement. Sometimes they may not have a rent agreement. So the telco is often caught in the process as to whether to deny a connection to someone, which is actually fundamentally very important for that person's livelihood, so that he can reach out to his family, he can conduct his profession or whatever trade he is carrying out in the city. So it's very integral to a person's livelihood to have a SIM card or have internet or mobile connection, right? So in that sense, there are so many shortcuts that are at play, and currently if you just rely on the KYC database, it won't be an accurate solution to solve this problem. But having said that, the thought process that look, not everyone in the same chain should be doing the same KYC over and over again, I completely agree, right? So it should be the primary responsibility of the infrastructure provider. When we look at telecom is basically the infrastructure on which the digital layer is built, and we should give the sort of prominence that it deserves and regulate it as a base infrastructure and ensure that proper KYC is done at the telecom layer rather than expect the OTT players to do the KYC. For instance, there are multiple parallels for this. Even look, where we have a decent, robust system of KYC is actually when it comes to banking sector, the financial sector, right? That's because of the fact that we have FATCA obligations, we have PMLA, the money laundering obligations, etc. Much robust KYC, video KYC that are different. Secondly, when you look at the financial sector KYC, you can see that, look, if I am, take the example of a PPI issuer, a prepaid instrument issuer, right? Payment using their UPI or the ultimate base layer KYC at the banking layer is already done. We should definitely incorporate the same principles of philosophy to KYC. There should be more ways for KYC to happen, and there should be more ways in which the government could even do for batch level. You could look at the telcos probably should implement technologies, including AI/ML technologies, to understand frauds. The sort of they can use metadata to figure out are there repeat offenders who are submitting various documents and different name and KYC at the OTT layer itself.
So I'm going to get back to you on your name should pop up. It seems like that seems to be the intention, right? And we've been, obviously there are services that do this, there are third-party services that do this, but anyone can answer this question about whether there's a technical impediment for this also happening on OTT communication apps, right? So if there were a system where telcos are able to do this because they have the KYC system where you're not with an OTT communication service, what does that mean?
So I'll just take this because banking came out and just evolved where you can just open an account with and the telcos are still brick and mortar stores. The last mile is still very manual. Go to your shop, go to your hotel. So this reminds me of someone I know who's worked on a very large scale financial inclusion, especially group. So this entire program was essentially run by ITs. And when they started doing it, that the financial inclusion in rural areas was a very difficult problem to solve a few years ago. Because when you go to a village, you ask people what's your date of birth. People don't even know what their date of birth is, right? And projects led to evolution of banking, and there is a certain spectrum of telcos that is evolving at the technology level where you now essentially can have a virtual phone number. And you can talk a lot more about this because again it's a tel, right? But folks, right? Then you're going to leave out the without it. Now that why do we need to have multiple beacons or multiple entry points for identity? Let's have a central platform where data can be secured properly, and like there have been efforts. For example, DigiLocker, right? Perfect place. Considering it's secure, that's a separate topic. Considering it's a central place, you just put in the details, it goes, checks, and says yes, you are right. We move. So, can the central platform be done? Somebody needs to build a central platform. Secondly, very much similar to financial inclusion activities, which reach out to the last mile, to every village, rural areas, parts of the country that people like you and I don't really go to. That telco evolution probably needs to accelerate if we want to make this.
That let's not replicate the KYC process again. We could actually increase the efficiency of existing KYC processes. We need to have multiple KYC processes, and we really need to keep in mind the target audience for
multiple avenues of KYC collection till you normalize. Right? In technology, we call it the normalization of something. You kind of build a baseline and then say, okay, now that I have a baseline, everything gets built on top of this. Today, it's disparate.
we're not there yet.
We need efforts to be there.
So I want to come to Kunal because I know you work at this intersection of human interest stories of people who have had to tell. Any examples come to mind where people have actually struggled because of the way in which KYC and identity verification is operating right now?
I mean, there's a lot of digital identity examples across the world as well. I mean, of course, forget the fact that there are some people who may not have KYC for my family. There's been a significant amount of sort of, there's also the verification process that exists. For example, I think with a lot of the bank accounts, and I think inclusion is a very good sort of example in that sense, is because it's got the power of people that are unbanked in this country, people with low levels of digital literacy, who will not be able to understand how to even conduct any KYC process, which may not have capabilities. So not only are we sort of increasing the cost of affordability in the sense of the device and data tariffs in that sense, but we're also kind of made earlier, KYC, there's been a certain amount of it. We're still finding out how effective it is in itself as well. I think that's another point that I wanted to share is we're seeing a variety of different things. I think for the telecommunications sector specifically, so I don't, again, it's not to sound sort of everything is the problem, but it has to be a more holistic approach to solve even KYC and interception.
KYC in the fintech sector is very successful, also because of the competition. Right? Look at the number of players. And look at the number of players in the telecom space. So, we need a really competitive market for digital to completely unleash its animal spirits. Right? And solve all the problems. Under FIN, you have the CKYC registry, right? Which is a PMLA project, so to speak. And we don't know how it's used. It's being used by ED, right? So, we don't. So, we need, and the data protection bill is not going to save us. It's a pointless bill when it comes to government investments. It only protects us against only excess.
Very provocative.
So, is it provided because I'm using ED and the same sentence? But having said that, what I'm saying is, look, we can solve this problem through a CKYC regime per se. The other thing to really keep in mind is that even with the CKYC, we have large number of financial disbursed into thousands of amounts and goes, and the police just struggles just because of the sheer size and scale of this crime, right? So we are not going to entirely solve this problem, but a lot of problems can actually be solved.
Useful. Vivek, I want to come to you, and maybe with a slightly provocative question, but I know that this is something you've thought about, right? Which is, let me ask you just from first principles, this idea that we even need to verify a message exactly who the sender of this message is. Now, obviously, you provide a variety of services to your customers, one of which is the number masking tool. Obviously, virtual numbers came up. So, I really want to just test this assumption, right? Which is, maybe there are good reasons to mask your identity, right? And obviously, we've seen this apply, and a lot of internet companies right now are interested in this question because maybe this makes sense for, like I said earlier, communication is an ancillary service of our main platform, right? And of course, deal with customer masking and virtual numbers are key. So, can you help me understand my thinking on this, right? Which is maybe this is a
We were talking about privacy and not sharing the number. That's it. Okay? So you look at passenger trying to connect to a driver and both of them don't know the number. That's what was the whole thought process around number one. However, I think the use cases have differed. Now you look at the bank and a relationship manager trying to reach out to a customer, FD and interest rates. Now the guy has to send a file which cannot be done on a voice call. So you will definitely fall back onto WhatsApp or RCS or something.
Right.
Now, earlier you had to share your number effectively with the relation, having some trust, having some control, having some experience which is uniform to the end customer now. So we don't look at number masking anymore as a privacy only related stuff, but we look at it as a use case which enables customers experience, agents experience, gives some kind of a control. Number masking has transformed over the domain, right? Now, when you look at the KYC process, now you're talking about number masking from an organization or an enterprise perspective. It's no more two people or peer-to-peer communication. Now, when you look at number masking, of course, we'll have to use some telecom and some OTT. We talked about KYCs. Within telecom, the KYC process for retail and enterprise is different. Mobility and wireline is different. Mobility, it says the user list has to be uploaded by the enterprise. For wireline, it does not require anything like that. But when you look at OTT, in a situation where there is a puzzle which is not solved, there are so many broken pieces there, and we are talking about regulating something else. On the other hand, the government says we want to be digital India, we want to enable the entire population of India. So I don't want to be really provocative.
I said that before they are, so this is good.
But it just feels like just replicate whatever is the process there on telecom onto these OTT. Will that work? Will it impact our future plans? What about those startups who are trying to accommodate you to innovation and growth rather than just saying the bill does not suit? Because I think there are a lot of pieces which needs to be discussed.
No, I think you make a really good point to make about why are we blindly following what's been the case so far, right? One of the examples I was thinking of in terms of he was talking about how when the App Store was first launched, they just launched the App Store. They didn't require again any emails, any mobile sign up because they realized this was a vulnerable community, right? All they did was basically identify people based on their device ID, right? So maybe there are other unique identifiers, right? It doesn't have to be your real name. I mean, does this trigger any?
I just add one more thing. I just forgot to tell you. Telecom is not one license. Telecom is 22 licenses in India. So we already have a situation that one person to operate. Now the OTT guy, I am starting off something in, let's say, Bangalore, and will acquire customers all across.
Yeah. So anything issue on?
Yes, 2 points. One, the discussion that when we started, right, we talked about that there is no baseline, there is no normalization. I think it kind of points to that. Right? There are n number of entities floating around the system, each with its own ambiguities because something was probably done 20 years ago or something like that. So platformization will become from a technology standpoint like a very, very pressing need. The second part around, I like the things you talked about, right? The catch with them trying to go ahead and say, hey, we do need some sort of an identification. Over the years, I want to have a unique identifier too, I want to have a traceable identifier. If you look at how Apple has evolved, right, they essentially said you could reset the device UID at one point in time. Right. When that happened, I was working for an ad platform company, right, and we had to really overhaul all our systems because we were like, nothing works now. All your user preferences are on a sensitive app like Grindr. You want to make sure that frauds don't happen, right? At the same point in time, traceability in the wrong hands can essentially lead to unraveling a lot of personal information for somebody. And this is where at some point in time I think we will have to talk about cybersecurity layers and how diligent people are around distributing. Right? So it's a multi-layered problem. It's a platform problem. It's a problem with traceability. Like there are multiple aspects to it. There is no one angle with which you
Google are implementing some of these, which again have downstream impact. So I think very curious to see the future of this. There's been discussion about whether they should be and not be fixed to one ID. So I think this from a technical point of view, this is evolving. So I think that I'll go back to the point you made. The rules and regulations will be very important. Both it's flexible, it's progressive. Perhaps that's something that we can improve on. Yeah, Kunal, anything before I move on to the next?
It's an ambit of regulation too. What happens and moreover privacy is a feature. Immune to cyber attacks, right? We are trying to create all this. I think that we've seen very protected that have been almost like hostage sometimes. Too. So I think making sure that the company is also. I know that we have digital protection, the BPDB on the side. We have that in place now.
So yeah, definitely I think an existential for several types of business models and technology, perhaps those that are focusing on things like privacy, etc. So I want to shift the criticisms that people like us in this room get is that you guys are stroking aware, there's a lot of fear and uncertainty and doubt unnecessarily being stoked. The fact is, and you'll know this better than anyone, is that potentially anything can already be licensed, right? So if I could just ask you, right, I don't know where you stand on this issue, but even if you were to play a devil's advocate, to say that, yeah, okay, maybe we are misjudging the intent of the government, right? It isn't really to license Signal and Telegram and all of this, right? The intention is that, but is there anything in the framing of this Telecom Bill that's different from the Unified License or the Telegraph Act essentially that is a source of concern for you as a lawyer?
Yeah, I think the whole definition section is a big concern, right? So, despite the fact that they colonized some of the world, I think they got the laws really right. They work together, so we know the quality of each other's work. The government of this right now is that everything is included, including software. Especially if you look at telecom equipment, right? Software is specifically included. Telegraph definition under the Indian Telegraph Act and the Wireless Telegraph Act was very, very hardware specific, right? Also, there was a very, very nice exception in the 1885 bill. That's how how.
There was an exception in the.
It was an exception. Now, if you look at it, there is no similar exception. So, whoever is drafted completely ignored the light exception, which means that all the free spectrum that we use, including technically infrared for your TV remote, technically is a telegraph and the licensable spectrum, or argued to be licensable after the bill has given to this bill.
Right.
And in effect, what is happening right now is that the earlier telegraph bill, you're right, the services definition under the licenses were brought. But because of the fact that the telegraph definition and section 4 licenses were issued for that telegraph, the delegated license which came from that section 4 could not have been broader than the ambit person, right, of the panel institution.
Right.
So we used to give other sort of value-added services, and they were included within the ambit of license because that is a license model there. Not just in India, even abroad, US also, AT&T used to provide all these services, right? So, to that extent, the licenses cover these services and still continue to cover some of these value addition AGR. Whereas, if you were providing in a different company or WhatsApp, need not pay AGR, right? That created that sort of lack of level playing field, so to speak. And I believe that's the real genesis of the discussion, not really, and surveillance and national security is the genesis of the discussion, not really spam, not really other things which really affect services, right? It's basically that pushed by the telcos section that it needs to be completely redrafted and overhauled. There are other problematic sections in the bill, but I think the major problem is with the definition section. That is really, really wrong.
The next one,
which make telegraphs which can work with, then that will be regulated by the NTCT, and an OEM like a Cisco or whoever can use to get it certified under the government lab. Hypervisor is a software. Hypervisor or Citrix or one of these things, you use a hypervisor software so that your PC can act as a remote virtual PC, right, which can be accessed through a lease lab. The government has included that under the NTCT notification. Hope that that's the case. In fact, last time we had a discussion, I said that's where the government is heading to. Now with this NTCT and prior regulations, I'm not sure.
So you're saying they're being very granular and they are exercising their power to make very granular imposition of specific types of services.
I mean, it's possible. It's possible, right? You see, till 2 weeks back, I was thinking differently. I was thinking like you, right? And maybe it's a mistake. Maybe it's just things which are.
If you were to reword it, right, in your wisdom, these three specific entities I wanted to get your opinion on. Should they be covered under the same definition? Should they have different definitions? And should they even be in this? The telecom operators, OTT communication apps like WhatsApp and Signal, and video conferencing software like Zoom or Microsoft Teams and Google Meet and things like that. Should all three be part of this telecom bill, and should they be? And how should they be regulated?
So I think currently the way it's working, including our email service, which is pointless in my opinion. Now, with respect to apps which are providing a function which is similar to a telecom function, right? I don't really mind some sort of a regime which is a light touch regulatory framework, not really licensed.
Like Exeter?
Right? When I say I don't really mind, that's why with respect to these video conferencing and other things, even now it's a great. Because that audio text definition and the way in which TEC has defined audio text is fairly broad to cover some of these things. It's just a tightrope walk that a lot of folks are actually doing right now. And I believe it's over this license. So,
okay, we'll come to you, Vivek, on the left. You had points?
I had a couple. Like you mentioned the fact, right? There's very few players in the telecom industry, and now they're just putting in internet providers and all these platforms. Do you think it is partly also inspired by countries like the US, where over the years there are only two major telecom providers? Then there is Comcast. Like we only have one or two internet providers, and then they basically looked at that one and said, let's put it together. That's one part of the question. Part two of the question is that how does, it looks like that they have cast a net much far wider to say, let it catch as much as it can instead of being specific, because if I'm on a Zoom platform and I share my screen and that screen is playing a YouTube video, how would this really get on? Because that's like a platform inside another platform, right? It's platformception kind of. So do you think, what's your thoughts on any of these two? Because these are very policy questions, not a technology question.
So look, I think we are very much inspired by the US model. Our market is very much inspired by the US model, which I believe is a wrong thing to do because the markets are not comparable, right? But we've been following that model, and we sort of have been doing this national champions for telecom sort of a model for quite some time, and which is, I think, causing a lot of problems in the sector, including for spam. For instance, TRAI now has this co-regulator model for telcos to work. If you had 8 players, I'm sure 2 players would have come and said, come to my network, I'll ensure that I will stop every spam that comes to. But that competitive advantage is lost in a model like this, right? So it's a regulated design problem. So similar sort of design problem is inherited if we have limited number of players. And then I believe what's happening is that I think there is a lot of influence, and the problem with any licensing model is the fact that there is lack of transparency, right? We don't know what's happening between the DoT and the telcos, right? There is no law which governs it, it's just conversations which happen behind the closed doors. Anything can happen. Fines can be negotiated and not paid, non-compliances can be completely foregone by the regulator, etc. That is very different from a TRAI regulation model where it's much more open. If TRAI levies a penalty, it's in public domain. They have to go to court and litigate, right? So we need to, to sort of answer also your question, right? I think the government is following that model where they want to license and regulate it, and if OTT were to come on this licensing model per se, then the problem is that we lose transparency that we currently have. A Twitter or a WhatsApp will never go to court to fight an end-to-end encryption. It will be closed-door discussion between the government and these players. And that is dangerous for many, many reasons, including for the
That's an interesting practical point. Vivek, I know even Exodal has come up. I do want to ask you this, obviously based on your experience, right, operating in this, perhaps this grey area, but definitely a highly regulated area. One of the arguments we've heard, and some of the experts in previous Hasgeek conversations have talked about it, is that licensing should apply to scarce resources, right? Spectrum, right? The numbering system is scarce, we need to issue numbers, license those entities, right? So I'm taking that question, my earlier question, a little forward, right? Okay, perhaps there is no scarce resource that WhatsApp is using or that a video conferencing software is using, right? So perhaps those shouldn't be licensed. But a player like yourself, right? You're providing cloud telephony services, you're leveraging telecom resources, perhaps directly from telecom operators. So what is your view on this, right? Given what some of the experts have been saying is that you cannot have an indefinite passing down of licensing requirements. Only the primary user of telecom resources, as Nikhil was saying, the infrastructure provider, should obtain the license. All downstream entities after that should not be licensed. Is that a view that you hold as well?
Yeah, I think that is the view I personally hold. Simple reason is this: if you were to kind of ask everyone to do the verification, validation, then you'll also ask about how they're going to store that information, how they're going to apply policies around it, how are they going to upgrade as and when the DoT or the TRAI recommends a newer version of the compliance. How about the data privacy leakage and all that which can happen there? Who's going to control them? So I have two questions around that. And besides that, you look at a startup, right? If you look at a startup, does he really have the time to sit down and build a KYC process? Is it that he wants to solve a KYC problem, or is it that he is trying to solve some problem in the world, right? Now the telcos also have had their share of this one. If you really look at the telco history, we grew from one operator to 11 operators, and then we came down from 4 operators. Telcos have been under pressure because every 3 years or 4 years there is always a new technology talk which is that 4G, 3G, 4G, 5G. Now we are already talking about 6G. So telcos have also been evolving, and the startups are trying to fix a problem which the telco is not able to do because either it is regulated or too complex to achieve in a telco. And if you push him to do the KYC, you are really going to impact the innovation or the ability to digitize India. That's the concern I think I hold, and incidentally we are also a telco operator now. Yeah. We have a ULBNO license with us. We follow all that, but if you were to push us to have the license and do the KYC exactly the same way what telcos had to do 10 years back, I think it would have been too tough for us. I think the scale has given us that ability to do that now. But then a VNO or a ULBNO? ULBNO.
So actually, can you speak a little bit because that a little bit more in detail? Because one of the things we've heard is exactly the point you made. For startups, it's going to be incredibly difficult, right? Licensing does not just mean KYC. It means essentially building out an entire compliance function within the company. Right? There are financial obligations, privacy implications. Right? You have to understand the commercial implications and how revenue implications and how they need to be passed on. So the financial implication of that. So, has it been difficult to be able to have to manage this for a company at your scale? And can you maybe think about what the situation will be for a startup and what?
Yeah. So essentially, incidentally, most of our sales happens B2B, right? So it is the enterprises. So we do verification of the enterprise. But the indications are that even without this new KYC or the telecom bill, the indications are that the KYC process even for the enterprise is going to be much more stringent. So today, if enterprise buys, let's say 100 mobiles to give it to all their employees, they take it in the name of the company and then just do a user upload list. But it looks like the future is going to be around authenticating each and every user, which means you need to have a photograph and an authenticating user. And imagine that if I have to onboard 100 people, I'll have to go with the biometric, and I do not have the footprint which is required by for us to do that kind of validation, right? We are probably, if you look at the scale at which the investments have been done by telcos, whether it is Jio or Airtel or Vodafone, and the kind of scale at which they have rolled up the network and put feet on street to do all these kind of things, I don't think we can afford that even today. Right?
And also just to think of, this is just for bulk connections which are like enterprise connections. There is another segment, IoT and end-to-end, right? Yeah. Just look at every possible device on planet Earth is going to be connected. Yeah. And for which you need large number of devices, right? That's an entirely different regime which applies to it. Just look at the complexity that we are talking about. And to talk about this ULBNO, right? ULBNO is supposed to be a service license which is light framework license. Everything that's there in the UL is there in the ULBNO. Same conditions, security conditions, IPDR conditions, KYC conditions. Why did you create a light frame license? What is different is, I think two things which are different markedly is the fact that you pay lesser amount, entry fee, right? Other than pretty much the compliance obligations are all the same.
Yeah. So one interesting fact is I worked on UL licenses for a long time, and when I had to adopt the ULBNO, all I had to do is custom paste. So it was easy for me. So
yeah, but not everyone can hire the next telecom executive, I think.
Yeah, but also what happens is, right, when you create too much diversification, too much specification, right, the cut copy paste model is what eventually comes around.
But like Nikhil, I think the point he's trying to make is, you want to reduce those entry barriers for startups, right?
Yeah, exactly.
If you're saying it's like that model, essentially it should be a permissionless system.
I personally know 5 startups in Bangalore who have not been able to take a license. Also because there's another complexity, right? If you have a ULBNO license in Karnataka, can I, because your customer may be somewhere else, right? I mean, can I connect and merge the call here? Or can I sell the same service outside? It's not entirely clear because the actual telecom function is only happening in Calcutta.
So, I mean, and then maybe you can kind of keep me honest on this one, right? The way this license thing has propagated, one of the ways the business models can evolve is to say, let's say everybody's a license holder. They cannot sub-license or do anything like that. But what they can do is they can essentially build a platform or a service where they ask all of these startups to come and sell it to them as a service to say, look, you don't need to worry. We have the infrastructure, we have the capability, we have the security. You essentially use identity as a service model so that you do not have to take and like I said, eventually it will all come back to normalizing, baselining and platformization of technology if you want this to properly. Otherwise, in the current way some of the systems are written, adoption is going to be very difficult, cybersecurity and data leakage is going to be hard.
Just to add, probably, when I was talking about all of this, right? If you ask my personal opinion whether vocation should be regulated, I am for regulating it. I am for regulating it. It's not that we do not want it to be regulated. But then it should not be at the cost of innovation. Like we are talking about KYC, like we talk about lawful interception. Lawful interception is even more deeper. KYC is probably a little lesser complex than lawful interception. So you cannot burden them. That's the whole point we are saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've heard this, I think, from multiple people. I think just final set of comments I want to get. I know we are at time. We could keep going on, and it's very intense conversation. But I just want to get some final thoughts on a bunch of different questions from each of you based on what we talk about. Kunal, if I can start with you, right? Really, I think one of the points we really wanted to bring out is what's going to be the downstream impact of this. And I know in your report you mentioned some of this. I'm sure all of these conversations again, right? And I meant to ask you this, Vivek, but obviously when there is such a big branch burden on a company like you, and obviously you're operating in the B2B space, but whether it's B2B or B2C, these costs are eventually going to be passed down to customers, right? And I believe that's a finding in your report as well. So if you could just take a step back, right, based on this conversation, based on some of the obligations that might be imposed, some of the downstream impact on privacy, on loss of access, or increasing costs, on restricted access to globally privacy-preserving technologies. What do you think is going to be the future for the Indian telecom user? And if I can just ask you again to put your policy hat on and to think about this question, right, in the way that I frame it, which is India wants to be this global leader for telecom industry, right, for telecommunication in the world, right? That's why that's the stated objective in the NDCP, right, the National Digital Communications Policy. Where does user rights, right, and autonomy and all of what we've been talking about fit into this? Can you be a global leader for telecom? Can India be a global leader for telecom without accounting for some of the issues that we have discussed, whether it's impact on startups, but also the impact on the end user?
That's a great question. Taking even a step further back, what does leader actually mean? Right? We are already progressing. India is kind of one of the biggest economies in terms of its infrastructure, in terms of its technology. We are already kind of at this technical mass structure. So what do we really mean by leader? Do we want to actually be responsible, safe, helpful, enabling leader, or do we want to actually just have a lot of numbers that we can kind of spit out? Right? The impact across, and I mean, this is taking a lot today from this conversation, it's quite helpful to actually get a perspective on how this is kind of done, right? It's almost in a way going to get passed down inevitably towards a variety of different stakeholders. It's not also just pertinent to the private sector, to the users, there's going to be a massive cost for governments too. Let's not forget the level of sort of capacity building that needs to happen, technical upgradation that needs to happen. Legal linking is sort of in a term I still understand how that would implicate. So it's a variety of different things that emerge, and I think what happens really is identifying what are the key sort of things we want to prioritize. So let's say innovation is one of them. Let's say user protection is one of them. Data protection at sort of mass levels is one of them. I think these are some things that we can't now not have that conversation about. We're having these conversations globally. India is kind of leading the race in terms of technology application, selling products, responsible products. We have technology providers that are influencing the system in a variety of different ways. So the leader part, I think, just really needs to be defined, figuring out what the priorities are. And from the policy perspective, I think we just need to kind of figure out how to actually understand what we are regulating or what we're even thinking of regulating. And we had this conversation, I think, a few days back, and at its very core, it's almost like voice versus data, right? That's kind of what we're thinking about. And if we're not able to see the difference in the two at the very core level, how are we actually thinking about doing that together? So this, and coming back, I think, to the same rules thing, it's not the same service. It's not the same sort of even mechanism for service, right? We are trying to sort of make sure that policy is helpful for the people. If that is the goal, then we should try and do that more robustly. We should try and do better sort of governance mechanisms. There has to be an improved understanding of what actually the user wants. Today, for example, I consider myself very fortunate. If WhatsApp starts charging me for a freemium sort of service, there are other alternatives, and I don't know if that's something that can be escaped. There are small businesses that use WhatsApp still, that use Instagram, maybe even, and a variety of different platforms that they use for their day-to-day operations. In case tomorrow something like this comes up, what happens then? Do I just sort of keep finding the next thing till it comes? How much memory do I need on my phone to find like 300 different applications? Switching between them comes back to the cost of information as well. We're expecting a large level of digital literacy, and we're expecting a large level of incentivization of people to actually look for these things, right? They're very big assumptions that we're making that we need to be a bit more mindful of, and I think understand that if the goal is, let's say, balancing innovation and understanding how to protect the use of us, we should really take one of those and kind of correlate it with the other.
Well, thanks, Mark. Rishu, last question for you. So, you've obviously been involved with different types of technologies, and from a couple of points, trying to pick on a couple of points you mentioned, right? This idea of baselining this process of KYC. You mentioned identity as a service, right? You mentioned potentially using technologies to identify spam and fraudulent behavior, right? Now you've obviously been involved in blockchain software technologies, you know how AI works, you know how different cybersecurity technologies work. What would you say are the best uses of some of these technologies? How should the Indian government be thinking about leveraging these technologies? And is there a role for mentioning any of these technologies in the regulation itself, right?
Look, we've been talking a lot about regulation, right? We've also been talking about user data, user identity, data protection, tamper-proof, right? And also the fact that you need huge amounts of capacity and scale in order to get this, right? This is why blockchain is pretty much the future. It's decentralized, offers some of these capabilities right out of the box, and that is why you can kind of end up using it. Now, the second thing that will end up happening is that new business models will end up evolving. For example, we at Norton, right, we do compliance for anything that is blockchain. Right? We work with exchanges, we work with LEAs as well, right, in order to detect any fraudulent activity, any illegal activity, whatever it may be. Right? And some of these spaces are going to become newer avenues at some point in time as well, which is, can you figure out that this identity is probably being forced around, or if there's something else that's going on around it. The second part that blockchain helps is because of the pseudo-anonymization. If you go to fintech, there's the whole idea of card tokenization. On blockchain, it's the idea of pseudo-anonymization, right? You're essentially using a generated token value or a generated pseudo-identity in order to identify you across. It can be reset, it can be generated every single time. Your KYC is, even though it's the basis for it, it is not being traded around, making it a lot more secure, right? So, yes, there are technologies around this. The second part of it is going to come around the cybersecurity part. The problem with most of this data, even if you move it to blockchain and say this data is secure, is not really secure. If I move all the data today, maybe if all practices are followed, data from this moment onwards has a chance of being secure, but the remaining data that was moved has already got so many fingerprints like floating around that it's very, very easy to do. The other part that I wanted to add around, services, right, especially players like WhatsApp and all, is, look, the moment that you have to be very, very careful around abuse using dark patterns. Right? Dark patterns are patterns that none of these players, even though they are legit license holders, should not be able to hold a user hostage. Like we use threads with Instagram, we use Instagram and then you cannot get rid of them. Now that's a dark pattern, right? There are multiple considerations that are going to come up around design, traceability, identity protection, cybersecurity, because this is, now we are moving into a very new space where the older laws, the older rules, the older way of doing things no longer applies. It's an increasingly digital world because today we are talking about SIM cards. The world is going to move to virtual phone number, right? Today you use a phone 99% of your day, you do it for anything except for making a phone call. I don't know why we still call it a phone, right? So it's a very new world, it's a very new dimension. Everybody will need to scale up, but like I said, newer businesses will evolve. Blockchain as a technology, companies working with blockchain will also start evolving with newer business models. Traditional businesses will also, and they're already moving, I think. You will know a lot more about it. So that's how it is.
Yeah, great.
So then, I'm sure all of us know that in telecom, unity and blockchain is already
Yes.
and I'm particularly happy.
But did you
Particularly happy about
happy about it? Yeah.
I think it will open up doors for a lot of use cases and solve a lot of other problems, maybe creating some new problems.
Yeah. When you say synonymous, I'm thinking solution. I'm also thinking for the government point of view problem. Vivek, last question for you, right? You said a very, I think, important point in your previous remarks, which is that when we look at the telecom bill as a whole, you personally believe that OTT communication app should be regulated, right? Which I thought is something that we should just, if you can, maybe in a couple of minutes, just talk about what that ideal state of regulation looks like, right? For someone who's been very objective, has seen this from multiple angles, what would an ideal state for OTT for regulation?
It's a light regulation is what we are talking about. Basically, see, the government has the responsibility of the safety and the secrecy of the citizens. Everybody has their own geopolitical situation, right? To that extent, whatever needs to be done, and government has to do that. I don't want to feel unsafe by somebody reaching out to me, but at the same time, if the guy is not at all allowed to reach me, then it's a different story. So I think to that extent, I think we're talking about light framework with some minimal regulations and rules. That's exactly where I say that the bill is fine. I'm hoping that the rules and regulations will be clearly something which is in the interest of the country and the startups and the technologies and everything.
Well, that makes sense. Perfect way to, I think, come to Nikhil, rules and regulations, right? I'm going to ask you again. There's this bill that we've criticized. Some people are in favor of it, some people are opposed to it. Very initial question: is this a bill that needs to go back to the drawing board? You need to start from scratch, or as Vivek said, this is actually something that can be resolved in the rules and regulations stage. Let's take it to Parliament quickly and adopt it. So that's part one. And part two, right? Since you mentioned this idea of regulatory design, and you talked about some specific deficiencies in the way that the government has approached the design of this bill itself. Do you have any, couple of top-level recommendations to the government in terms of regulatory approach and design in the telecom bill? So obviously, all of these comments are going to go from Hasgeek to the telecom secretary and the telecom ministry. So, we're hoping to put all of this together to something very specific that if you think should be part of that submission, that would be.
So, first of all, the definition section needs to be completely and that's probably number one.
So, that can't be resolved for rules and regulations.
No.
It needs to be resolved right now.
It needs to be resolved right now. And secondly, I think when we look at it, there is this interesting question of why government wants to regulate OTT apps. Right? I mean, and we can assume that government is trying to regulate OTT apps which are performing a function which is similar to telecom. Honestly, the government doesn't care much about revenue because I don't think even if they introduce encryption, even if they input some sort of AGS or the rule, it's not going to be a double taxation. There is a pass-through for EMIs. So I don't think government will do that. But they're worried about national security. Right? And national security, look, we don't have very friendly neighbors, and it's a fact. Right? It's not really, we don't have a neighbor like Canada or Mexico. We have Pakistan and China. It's a fact. And it is something that we need to live with, and the government is extremely concerned about that. Then there is also an interesting question about the stand that OTT players have taken with respect to encryption, which is question of encryption breaking, etc., etc. But ultimately, it all boils down to surveillance. Now, with respect to surveillance, I think if you ask me, the way to solve this problem, accepting the fact that we need surveillance and surveillance happens in every country, and one of the major premises of one of major ethics is actually the fact that there was surveillance directly done by many kings and eavesdropping and blah blah blah. It's in our culture. We accept that also. But what do we need? What we need to do is, I believe the Supreme Court has done something fairly wrong in PUC judgment, whereby they did not apply the rules of physical world to digital world. I'll tell you why. If let's say that police is entering this premises and searching this premises, they need a warrant, they need a neighbor, they need a list and a ledger with respect to what is being found, what is being investigated, etc., etc. The government or the courts in this country has not applied the same rules when it comes to digital. You can snatch somebody's phone, you can just look at whatever is there is no sort of accountability, there is all sorts of interception which is possible at different levels. We need to build in various levels of accountability in the interception process, and the only way that we can do it is by having an ex-ante mechanism of review. Which, if we do it, then I don't think anyone should be uncomfortable in having government doing surveillance if you're living your life peacefully. Right? Now the question is, you don't know if someone is tapping my phone because I am dating someone's daughter, right? Or if I am plotting against a particular government. Right? So you don't know. It could happen for any reason. So I think once you do that and that regulatory design is implemented into the system, I think all problem with encryption will be gone. Even if there is a light touch framework, regulatory framework on the OTT apps, it's not going to hurt any one of us. We'll all live our life.
Great. Thank you very much. On that note, I will end this panel. I am going to take 2 minutes to just wrap up. And I was just going through my notes, and there's just so much that I would take a long time to kind of recap this. So I'm just going to end this with, the way that I look at this really is that there are 3 dimensions to this. I think we should be looking at the draft Telecom Bill in 3 dimensions. There is a social dimension, a technical dimension, and a regulatory dimension, right? And I think this panel was really helpful to even clarify for me what these different dimensions are as we dissect this bill, right, and as it passes through Parliament. First, from a social perspective, I think some of the examples and points you made about who are the intended audience of or targets of this KYC process, right? And what are the difficulties they might suffer? What are the current challenges that different businesses might face in trying to ensure that KYC is done, right? And then there were lots of solutions potentially for how to ensure that this is done in an inclusive way. So I think there's a very important social dimension to this, and that's obviously not to mention the privacy, security dimensions. I think that were raised more recently, right? So I think there's a social dimension to this which is very important. 2, from a technical perspective, I think we were hearing this point about creating a baseline around how all of this should operate, right? And I think really some of the key attributes that came up was, how do we make sure that this is scalable, whether it's identity verifications or increasing innovation, right? Really trying to think about technologies, whether it's blockchain or AI or DLT, to be able to ensure that these are scalable, interoperable, decentralized, and in some ways privacy preserving technologies. So I think the use of technology really to solve some of these problems was, I think, an important takeaway for me. And finally, from a regulatory perspective, I really appreciate into what you said, and the way that I was thinking you should think about it is people say same service, same rules. I think we should think about same service, same safeguards, right? Whether it's offline or online, whether it's on the telecom operator or if it's communication apps, we need to ensure that users are protected. So really, we need to have, I think, that kind of thinking. So with that, folks, we'll bring this event to a close. Zena, anything else from you? All right. Thanks. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Great conversation. All good, Zena?
Yes. Should I have
You want to go grab a bag or something? You want to go grab a bag or something?